Welcome to Business Talk. And we know the nation is on tenterhooks as the seventh administration takes shape. And I think one thing the new government is going to have to get to grips with is how we tackle the unemployment crisis in South Africa, which is inextricably linked to the skills crisis in the country as well. And today we've got a very special guest, Dr. Olebogeng Selebi, who's the Deputy Director of the Centre for the Future of Work at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Selebi is a strategic communications expert. She's got a wealth of experience in business management and a PhD in communication management. So Dr. Selebi, it's really great to have you on the show because I think you're perfectly equipped. Hopefully you can give the new administration some advice here on how we tackle these challenges. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for a very warm welcome. I'm doing well. I hope you're well too.
Yeah, I am. And like you, and I think like all South Africans, we just wait with bated breath to see what kind of government forms. But I think to my introductory comments, one of the big issues that any administration is going to have to really get its hands dirty with is this issue of unemployment, and it is linked to skills. Can you just elaborate when you think of South Africa needing to narrow its skills gap? We often hear the word skills gap. What does it mean to you, and why is this crucial for our future workforce?
Well, I mean, the reality is, as you said, Michael, we're living in very interesting times right now. And I think we're all looking forward to what's going to unfold over the next few weeks in our country. The reality is that those of us who have the privilege to work, because I do believe that being able to provide for yourself and for your family through work is a great privilege. But those of us that do have that privilege will spend around a third of our day working, right? So that shows how much time is actually spent in the work environment and the importance as well of understanding this environment and the skills that are required to get into the work environment and also to sustain a long-term career, which is very important, right? So when we look at some of the skills that are required in the current and future work environment, you'll notice that there are a lot of changes in that environment. For instance, if I have to think back to when my grandparents worked, for instance, a lot of the skills and a lot of the work that they did may not exist in this era. And the reality is, if we look 5 or 10 years into the future, a lot of the skills and a lot of the jobs that exist now may not be relevant in the future. And a lot of those skills may not be relevant in the future. So when we're talking about this skills gap, basically, what we're focused on is the skills that are being produced within the nation versus the skills that are required by our economy and required by industry, right? Because that's one of the things that we've noticed is that very often as institutions of higher learning and even in the basic education environment, right? Because we can't just focus on higher learning. The reality is even the work that we did when we were little kids in grade one, that still matters, right? Because you're building upon that skill that you learned from a young age. So the reality is that the skills that we are producing are not really relevant to the environment that we exist in. Even in the university environment, I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to employers and some of them have told me, we got all of these graduates from this particular institution and a lot of the skills that they have don't really align with what's happening in the workplace. Yeah. So when we're talking about that skills deficit, that skills gap, that's what we're referring to, is narrowing the gap between what we are teaching people and the skills that are actually required by the workplace.
Yeah, that certainly accords with the conversations that I have with executives. In banking, for example, I was chatting to a C-suite executive the other day, chief data and analytics officer, who said, Michael, give me 100 coders and we'll find jobs for them tomorrow. I just can't get my hands on these kinds of skills quickly enough. And I think that's an indication of that gap that you mentioned. Now, the Institute of the Future has highlighted that 85%, and I had to do a double take when I read this research, 85% of jobs by 2030 haven't been created yet. That is it's a staggering statistic. And I've got 2 children who are going through primary school at the moment. And I've got to think, well, how are we going to prepare our workforce for these unknown future roles? How do you approach it at the Institute?
Well, the reality is, as you've said, a lot of jobs that we even currently have now did not exist just a while ago. As you said, you have children, and a lot of people have said that a lot of their children, when you ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? For us, we would say, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer. Those were the basic things, the police officer. I don't know if maybe you wanted to be a fireman. I'm not sure. But those were the generic things that we wanted to be. Now you have children saying, I want to be a YouTuber. That's something that never existed. We definitely did not have the option to be YouTubers. If you, for instance, even look at because there's a big shift now in the energy environment to greener forms of energy, right? And there's a big conversation about green hydrogen. So what are some of the skills that will be required in that environment? They're probably not skills that we have currently. So you can see that there's a lot of change that's happening. And it's important that institutions of higher learning and institutions of basic learning have to have a strong relationship with the external environment, right? That's one of the things that we see coming to the fore more and more and becoming more and more important. Because as academics, we still have a very siloed approach to work. And also we tend to, I don't know if I could use this term, but I wanted to say over intellectualize certain things, but to some degree that does happen quite a bit, because as academics, we have research priorities, right? If I walk into my office today and I ask my boss, what does he expect from me? The primary thing is research. Now, the reality is, are we producing socially relevant research? Now, that's a different question. So the only way that we can get to a point where we can fix some of this disjointment between the skills that are required by private sector and the skills that we are producing in universities, there has to be a closer relationship between the two. So private sector has to be able to come to us and say, okay, Ole, we are looking for 50 coders, as you've said, and we expect our coders to have this particular skill set and to know how to do A, B, and C. That way, we can integrate those skills into our curriculum. One of the other things that we've noticed that's very, very important is that universities or higher learning institutions are not producing enough entrepreneurs. That's very, very important, because we talk a lot about unemployment in this country and so forth. But here I am in an office working for someone, right? The reality is that more of the individuals that we are producing within the university environment should be given the option to use their skill to create employment. But unfortunately, we haven't made that cultural shift yet, right? So typically when you come to university and you come to study, your expectation is that you're going to take that skill and you're going to walk into somebody else's company and receive employment. But in a country like ours, and I'm actually going to make reference as being the academic that I am, I'm going to make reference to a study by a colleague of mine, Prof. Melody Bueta. And in the study that she conducted, she found that academic entrepreneurs, so those are entrepreneurs that come from an academic environment, that studied in a higher learning institution. She found that they tend to, it's very unlikely that they will start a business of their own, right? So the entrepreneurship rate amongst graduates is very low. But another finding that she had was that of the graduates that did actually create employment, they created employment in much more innovative sectors than individuals that did not have education. And also they were able to pay better salaries because their companies brought in much more money. So they're able to pay better salaries, and they're able to create more innovative employment in more innovative sectors. So that shows that as universities, we have a responsibility not just to make people employable, so giving them the skills to be employed, but also make them self-employable.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense if you think about often entrepreneurship being driven by a need. So if someone hasn't studied further and they've just got to hustle and try and, start their own, whatever it is, Bucky Brigade, building, doing things on the side versus, graduates who go into the professions and are highly qualified and skilled, which have this professional career path mindset, to your point. But when they do become entrepreneurs, you're talking about very high R&D, IP, intellectual type organizations that they will ultimately create. And those are the scalable big employers. So it's a great connection that the university is making here. We've also seen, though, with the recent unemployment data, that there is still a drop in the graduate unemployment rate in South Africa. So, I think most people would look at that, most young people, and say, right, if I want a job, I've got to be skilled. I've got to go and study further. What do you think that are the key factors that contribute to this decline?
Well, of course, there's the economic factors, right? So we don't have as much investment in South Africa as we used to. So a lot of people aren't starting a lot of very big businesses. So of course, that will cause a decline in the number of jobs that exist. But also, even when you look at the graduate unemployment rate, if you look at, I'm going to use the stats from the University of Pretoria for this point. The University of Pretoria had the highest rate of graduates employed 6 months after completing their degree. So if you were a graduate, I think it was maybe five years ago or so, just before the pandemic, at the University of Pretoria, 6 months after you completed, about 93% of students or graduates would have been employed 6 months after leaving university. Now, post-COVID, it dropped to around, I think, 85, 86%, right? So, of course, COVID was a factor as well that contributed. Yeah. But we are getting back to those pre-COVID levels. So it shows that unemployment amongst youth is a major issue, but as well, just looking at the economic situation, you can see that graduates are also falling prey to this whole issue of unemployment, right? So we do need to motivate more graduates to create employment and to create an environment as well for them to do so. But one of the major factors, and I don't know if you saw recently, I think it was about a week or two ago, the popular DJ Zinhle, I don't know if you saw, she said something in an interview saying that a lot of young people are unemployable, and people were very upset when she said that, because a lot of people felt that, okay, we've gone and gotten our degrees, we have all these qualifications, and now you're telling us that we're unemployable, right? But I do agree with the point that she made. Now, from my perspective, what she meant was that, again, the skills that are required for you to fill a certain position are lacking in a lot of young graduates and a lot of youth. Yeah. A lot of employed people as well lack a lot of these skills, right? And the skills that we perceived as soft skills, and I don't like the term soft skills, but that's the term that's widely used. Because when we talk about soft skills, people assume that they're not as important as your technical skills. And very often in the education environment, we equip people more with those hard technical skills, but not so much with those softer skills, right? So softer skills are things like critical thinking, right? Being able to think critically, being able to solve problems, being able to communicate effectively and express your points effectively. Things that we take for granted, like handling stress effectively, right? Handling conflict effectively. These are skills that, and even the ability to learn, right? We take that for granted, but a person's ability to learn information, take in information and make sense of it quickly and be able to adapt quickly to the environment that they exist in, those are considered soft skills. But if you have those skills, you can adapt to pretty much any environment, right? So the reality is that those are the skills that a lot of graduates are missing. So if you're a DJ Zinhle, for instance, and you own a store, you need somebody who can walk in and be able to interact with customers effectively, right? Someone who, I mean, if you've worked in sales before, you know that when customers are angry, that's not a good experience for you on the receiving end. How do you manage that, right? Yeah. These are all considered soft skills, but they're absolutely pertinent, especially in an environment where we have things like artificial intelligence. I mean, I come from the comms environment. Now you can use ChatGPT to help you write a media release, for instance, right? So there's so many things. But it still needs humanizing. It's exactly right. So that's where that soft skill comes in, your ability to take a document and make it more human, right? So these are the skills that are becoming more and more important. So yes, when she made that statement, I completely understood what she meant. It's that soft skill your ability to think critically, communicate, handle stress, very, very important skills that need to be better integrated into our curriculum, all the way from basic education to higher education.
It's interesting that you mention that final point, because often I think much of the soft skills that we think of, communication, critical thinking, general interaction, and how we handle stress, a lot of that comes through the foundational phases of education: good primary school, good high school, good home life as well, that rounds off an individual. So how can educational institutions better integrate the teaching of these skills into the curricula? And what role do you see at a higher level, like a University of Pretoria, for example, at the very back end of this pipeline? What do you see your role as?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that's very important, especially at a basic education level, something that we take for granted, is the ability to allow children to play. Right now, I remember when I was a child, and when we think back to our childhood, one of the things that I'm thinking of right now is that playful environment is very important, because it's an important part of you building your communication skills and also building problem solving skills, right? So, for instance, when we look at more industrialized economies, like China, for instance, I don't know if you've seen those videos of young Chinese students coding, right? And I always used to wonder, why are they teaching 6-year-olds how to code? What is the sense in that? And then I figured out that it's all related to computational thinking. Right now, I don't come from an IT background, but at least I know a little bit about what computational thinking is. And for the viewers that might not know, computational thinking is basically your ability to break a large problem down into its smallest components to help you problem solve, right? So when a person is coding, and basically coding is you have to tell the computer what it is supposed to give you, right? And let's say I have to brush my teeth. Let me just use that example, right? When we are brushing our teeth, you first have to say, okay, what are the steps? You have to take your toothbrush. Now, I don't know, there's a big debate about, do you wet the toothbrush first or do you put the toothpaste on first? Whatever your preference is, right? There we go. So that's your preference, right? But it shows that there are different steps to this process of brushing your teeth. So when you're coding, you use the same thinking. You can't just tell the computer, brush your teeth. You have to explain step by step the process that it has to fulfill, right? So when a child is in primary school and they're given Lego blocks and they're told to build a house, right? As the child is building this house block by block and they notice, okay, this piece doesn't fit, they remove that piece and look for a piece that does fit. That's problem solving. That's you saying, okay, there's an issue here. Let me figure out how to fix it, right? So we take for granted the necessity of playing for children. So that has to be much deeper integrated into the basic education system. And then how we would do this in higher education is, and even in corporates, because I do believe that it's important even in organizations to have this, is the integration of maker spaces. Now, we have one at the University of Pretoria, but from my knowledge, according to my knowledge, we only have one, and we should have a lot more, right? So maker spaces are basically playful spaces within your library environment or within your organization where a person can say, okay, I have this big problem. How am I going to solve this problem? I'll go to the makerspace. There are Lego blocks, there are charts, there are all kinds of dough and everything that I can play with to help me solve this problem, right? So we have a makerspace, but makerspaces should actually be throughout organizations. Organizations should have them, universities should have them. We should have them in government departments to help people learn how to problem solve. And that's you building your computational thinking skill, right? So according to, from my perspective, it's important to rethink the way that we are teaching and learning and problem solving within organizations.
Yeah, and those are some fantastic practical ways that we can incorporate this thinking either into our curricula or at the workplace as well. And I've seen often at startups that kind of mindset is very evident, and why startups do tend to innovate at scale and quickly and are nimble and agile and are generally better at problem solving than large institutionalized established corporates. There's another issue here that often we spend a lot of time training people, upskilling them, and once we've done that, they leave. And I know there's been a big brain drain recently for a whole range of factors, but what are the strategies that we can employ to retain skilled workers within the country?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that the issue of retaining skilled labor it's a multifaceted one, right? Because the reality is that when people leave the country, they don't only leave for economic opportunity. Especially in a country like South Africa, a lot of the people that leave are driven out of the country for a variety of reasons, right? So sometimes the focus of a lot of organizations is to say, how do we financially compensate people in a way that makes them want to stay? But the reality is that's not enough. When you look at the modern employee is very different from employees 10, 20, 30 years ago. And of course, I'm saying this from a position of privilege to some degree, because when I'm talking about the modern employee, I'm talking about someone with a comfortable job, a job like mine, right? A comfortable job, you earn a decent salary. That's the kind of person I'm talking about. An individual like this, because I'm sure you've heard about Maslow's hierarchy, right? I'm sure you've heard about Maslow's hierarchy forever, from the time you were much younger until now. We're all exhausted hearing about Maslow's hierarchy. But the reality is that when your more basic needs are met, you start to focus on higher order needs, right? Yeah. So that's why I'm not, in this example that I'm using now, I'm not talking about someone who's really at that survival point in their life, right? You start to think more about things that are higher order needs that you may have as a human being. So because of that, one of the things we've observed in the work environment is that we no longer see work as just a source of financial compensation. Yeah. And that's part of the reason that, especially in much more industrialized economies, if you observed a few years ago during COVID, we saw the great resignation, right? Because as people spent more time at home with their families, working from home and so forth, they started to realize, oh, there's actually more to my life than just sitting behind a desk. I actually enjoy spending time with my family. Who would have thought, right? So that's one of the things that we notice is that organizations, in order to keep people, they have to think more holistically. It's important to see a human being, the human being that works within your company, as a full, holistic human being with full needs. And how can the job that they are doing within your company, especially because you don't want to lose, your really, really smart individuals within your organization, you want to keep those people. So you have to think of them as holistic human beings. How can the job that I'm providing this person add to their life in general as a human being? That is a part of the solution to keeping people, retaining people within your organizations. It's not enough anymore to just offer people more money. I even had a conversation with one of my colleagues earlier today about a certain position that opened up. And he said, I don't care how much this institution would pay me for this job, I'm not taking it, right? Because he knows that it will be a very draining emotionally, mentally, and so forth kind of job. So we have to think more holistically about making sure that we are providing for the needs of people as full human beings and not just compensating them. That's part of the reason. Of course, we can talk about crime and all of these issues, but that's not a problem that I think you and I could solve today.
No. Well, I wish we could, but it sounded to me like the individual you were talking about maybe was thinking about taking the CEO of Eskom job, which is one of those that comes with awful amounts of stress. But
Michael,
also,
you're exposing me now. Everybody's going to know that that's the job. Right?
But we'll create higher purpose, though. If you think about selling that role to someone to say, right, you could be the person who solves load shedding in South Africa. So there are creative ways that we can tap into Maslow's higher orders of self-actualization and understanding what makes people tick. A lot of this will require collaboration between governments and employers for retaining skilled labor. And government can help with some of those other issues that you mentioned. How can this collaboration be effectively implemented as we look to the seventh administration to really take what message the electorate delivered forward? And that is, we want you to work together to help us solve some of the country's biggest intractable challenges.
Well, that's absolutely true, and that's part of the reason that we even started the center, and we do have an online platform that's geared at pretty much being a connector between
Oh,
the different sectors, between private sector, government, and higher education, because we do have to work together. Again, as I said, as universities and as academics, we can't continue to just produce research for research's sake, right? It has to be socially relevant. It has to help government to create policies that help us to create the environment where more skills can be developed and more entrepreneurs can be developed as well. And then private sector, of course, has to tell us what skills are out there, what skills do you need, and also the funding would have to come quite often from private sector as well
yeah.
to help us do this kind of research and create the right kinds of initiatives. So I would say at the end of the day, I do believe that universities are that a neutral point between private sector and government, civil society, and so forth, to create that relationship. And to serve as a middleman, I guess, for the development of that relationship between government, private sector, and the university environment. So that was the reason that we created the center. And we do have a platform. It's fow.up.ac.za that people can have a look at. And basically the purpose of that platform is to serve as a collaboration point for these different stakeholders.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that platform? Because that's really interesting, and the first that I've certainly heard of it. How does it bring all of these role players together, and what are its primary objectives if you look at it through that lens?
Well, I mean, we have several different objectives. So what we've done is, because when you think about the future of work, it's extremely broad, right? As we're talking about the future of the work environment, the future of education, how technology impacts on the way that we work. There's so many different facets to it. But what we've done is we've developed 6 different research clusters, right? Because what we want to do is to create a research platform, or we have created a research platform that conducts research on the future of work, the future of education, so that we can develop solutions that are based on real world research, right? So we're not just creating platforms that will not apply to the South African context, but we want to create solutions that are South African centric, right? So what we've done is we have 6 research clusters. So it's the future fit education. So that's for students. How do we develop an education system that is future fit? Then we also have future of work skills development. So if you're already an employee within an organization, how do you make sure that your skills align with the needs of your organization going forward? We look at the 4th industrial revolution. That's the 3rd one. The 4th one is Society 5.0. So Society 5.0 looks at the link between technology and society, or creating a society that is fueled by technology, but where you don't forget to be human-centric, right? So we don't let technology take over to the point where human beings are
AI is going to take our jobs.
And then isn't that something that we're also scared of? And then we also look at the platform economy, which is very popular now with Uber and all of these different platforms. How do we make those platforms work more effectively to create more employment? And then the 6th and final one is renewable energy. So how do we make sure that with all of this renewable energy changes that are happening, how do we make sure that jobs and skills align with that? So basically, the platform is just there so that if anyone from government or private sector would like to connect with us, they can say, we want to work with you on this particular cluster. Who can you connect us with, and what research work and interventions can we develop from that? So that's basically how that
Fantastic.
works.
Share the URL again. What's the URL for that platform?
It's fow.up.ac.za.
Fantastic. It reminds me of an old line from a CFO to his CEO who says, we're training our people and we're spending all this money on them. What if they leave? And the CEO looks at him and says, well, what if we don't train them and they stay? At the end of the day, you really have to invest in these things. You have to collaborate, and you have to
True.
at the the upper end of the skills ladder. You have to continually reinvest in your people who are desperate to gain these new skills and acquire these new skills of the future to to incorporate things like AI so they don't end up overtaking us at the end of the day. Dr. Olebogeng Selebi, thank you very much, Deputy Director at the Centre for the Future of Work at the University of Pretoria. Absolutely fascinating conversation on how we close the skills gap and prepare for the future of work here on Business Talk. Take care.